Thank you so much. So nice to be here. And Senator, thank you so much for joining us here at Bold versus Old. We're going to have a lot of conversation today about what bold is, what bold means to you.
Yeah.
But I actually want to start with something a little more personal.
Okay.
You and I are both Californians, proud Californians,
Yes, we
I think
are.
it's fair to say. We both came of age in a state that is now known as the hashtag state of resistance.
Yeah.
So what does that mean to you? Why are you proud of being a Californian, and what lessons do you think California can teach the rest of the country, and what cautionary tales?
Yeah, that's a great point. And we're both from Oakland, California.
We're both from Oakland. Oh, yeah. We're both from Oakland. My parents, who are probably watching or listening, or maybe they're tweeting about this, I don't know, but they're from Chinatown.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we really,
Which is one of the oldest Chinatowns in the country.
It is.
Yes.
It is, yes.
I think that part of what the significance of being from California, I think of many things. One, just in terms of my own experience, having been born and raised there. You know, my parents met when they were graduate students at UC Berkeley in the 60s, and they were active in the civil rights movement. And so my sister and I joke we grew up surrounded by a bunch of adults who spent full time marching and shouting about justice. And people may not remember what a hotbed of activity is, in particular in the Bay Area, around the 60s and the 70s, in the fight for civil rights, in the free speech movement and all that. So it was a very rich environment, incredibly stimulating. And then if you layer upon that, you know, the work that has happened in California in terms of the investment in research and science, and so you then can see how Silicon Valley was born and the beginnings of that. You can look at it in terms of California as perhaps a bit of bravado, I will confess, but you know, that old expression, so goes California, goes the rest of the country, if not the world. So there is something about California that has always, and not to the exclusion of any other state, I am spending a lot of time in a lot of states.
You love all states
so
equally?
I love all states equally.
Right.
But there is something about, at least I think our experience, and certainly my experience, that taught us to see what can be unburdened by what has been. And it's very empowering, because then it is an environment that encourages us to imagine what can be in pursuit of making the condition of life better for all people. Imagine what can be in terms of the pursuit of innovation, right, which is about pursuing that which will allow us to be more accurate and efficient and faster, and understanding that the pursuit of innovation also is not a pursuit of something because we're bored with things that have been, but because we want to be more efficient and effective, and I would suggest also by extension, and more relevant. And so those are the broad takeaways that I would offer in terms of what it means to be from California, but not to the exclusion of any other state.
But I would just add one other thing about California before we turn to talking more broadly about the economy. You know, California is a multiracial democracy. Mm-hmm. Wasn't always a multiracial democracy. Yeah. But I think as we both have seen it become that, and that is a very important example also, which I know is something that you are deeply invested in.
But I want to add something, just to hopefully not pour water on that, but still. As with many places, there is an incredible amount of diversity, but there is also an incredible amount of segregation.
Yes.
That exists in California also. And you and I know this in terms of being from Oakland. You and I know this in looking at what's going on in San Francisco, or even Los Angeles, or anywhere in the country. There are many places where there is a diversity of the population that relates to ethnicity and race and a number of other issues, including socioeconomic condition, but those are also communities that are very segregated.
Right.
And we can never overlook the significance of that.
I completely agree with that. So let's talk about that for just a minute. But let me just say, the reason I mentioned California as a multiracial democracy is because people of color, people from all different racial backgrounds in California hold office, run for office, and that is, I think, one important marker, not the only marker.
I agree.
But let's turn to this question of communities of color, segregation, and the ways in which the rules of our economy have really created that. That segregation did not happen by accident, right?
Right.
So my organization, the Roosevelt Institute,
Yeah.
talks a lot about the rules of the economy and also how those have been racialized. And by that we particularly mean the ways in which rules have been written to privilege corporations
Yeah.
and to actually allow corporations to extract wealth
Yep.
and frankly extract life from poor people, often poor people of color,
Yeah.
often poor black and brown kids.
That's right.
So in your career, in your work, what have you seen of that? What do you find the most pernicious? But also, where have you seen times like, we actually can use government, public power, to make that better, to rewrite those rules? So talk about that a little.
Yeah, well, one of the most profound professional experiences that I had with this issue was when I was Attorney General of California. So I was elected and started in January of 2011, which was right after there had been a finding that the top 5 banks in the United States had been engaged in the awful conduct of doing a number of things, including these mortgage-backed securities, creating this financial instrument that ended up duping a lot of people into investing in bad investments. It also encouraged predatory practices around mortgages and mortgage lending. And they also were found to have been robo-signing foreclosures. So basically letting
Clear
foreclosures
fraud,
go
right?
through.
Clear fraud.
Oh yeah, letting foreclosures go through without doing the due diligence to determine if those families actually deserve to lose their home. And so I became Attorney General just after that finding, and the question became, well, what to do about it? And because California during those years had often 7 of the top 10 cities hardest hit by the foreclosure crisis, we took a role of leadership. At the beginning of that negotiation, the banks, offered us, California, $2 to $4 billion. And people around me said, oh, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of money. I said, well, a lot of money as compared to what? And so then, being kind of anal, I guess, I hired a bunch of accountants and people because I wanted to know how underwater were the families in each county in California, so I could compare that number to something. Quickly learned that they were offering us crumbs on the table. And I eventually, because they were not offering California a fair deal, pulled California out of the negotiation process, which was very controversial. We believe it was from the banks that they would send flyers out to every state saying, if Kamala Harris is not in this deal, this is what you won't get versus what you will get, all kinds of awful tactics. But I also want to add this, which is critically important. So then, but in the negotiation process, first of all, we know that families of color, immigrant families, the major and only financial transaction that they engage in that represents all of their wealth is buying a home. It's all of the folks who believe in the American dream.
And too few
Work
families
hard.
of color get the opportunity to do that. But for
Right.
those who do, then they're at the mercy of the banks.
And it is their asset. It represents all of their hard work. Not only financially, it's also one of the most intricate financial transactions most families and working families will ever engage in. And we saw then a disproportionate number of African American families who lost their homes, immigrant families who lost their homes. But here was the interesting thing. So in having the conversation with the banks, and these long, fancy tables and these fancy law firms, and the suggestion that they would make was that these families were trying to game the system, that they, in essence, got what they deserved. And the point is no, because first of all, and my team would get really upset with me for saying it in public, I say, look, I'm the top lawyer of the biggest state. And let me tell you, I own this little condominium, and when I bought my place, I didn't read each page I signed, right? So if you're trying to say that all these homeowners knew what they were getting into, most of us don't read it. We sit there with a broker who you would think they're buying a
Right.
home for themselves. They're all excited for you.
Check
And you
here.
sit there and you just sign away. They might as well be popping bottles of champagne. Everybody's happy.
They are popping bottles of
And
champagne.
they are in the back room.
Yes.
Right? And so these families are very trusting. That when you give them the loan, you trust that they have done the work to determine that you can actually afford it, right? Because that's the process you're supposed to go through. But the other thing is when they talked about these families were gaming the system. And then it was the CEO of the biggest bank who, when I called him, his name is Jamie Dimon,
Heard of him.
said to me, "You're trying to steal from my shareholders." And I said, "Well, my shareholders are the homeowners of California, and they're not getting the benefit of their bargain." And the thing about those conversations that was most upsetting is this: the tone that these working families were trying to game the system against the top 5 banks of our country, okay? So obviously that couldn't be right or accurate. But the other piece is this, and this is what I would say to them. I said, "You know what, let me tell you who these families are." I said, "Have you ever known somebody who was proud of their lawn?" Because that's who these families are. These are the families I grew up with. My second family, my second mother, Mrs. Shelton, and her husband, Mr. Arthur Shelton. Mr. Shelton would be out there. He was a construction worker. She ran a nursery school. He would be out there mowing that lawn, pruning those roses. It represented all, for so many Americans, that is about the pride of working hard. And to suggest that they're gaming the system was just wrong. And these are examples of what happens when you look at how, when unregulated, powerful financial institutions, and then there are plenty of examples of corporations, how they can harm unsuspecting consumers. And so I will say that part of it is that's why we need to have prosecutors who know how to prosecute those cases to make sure that those families get a fair deal in that process.
You should tell the end of that story.
Yes,
You pulled out of the
thank you.
negotiation. You weren't going to take crumbs on the table.
And as
You're
a result
yelling
of
at
the,
Jamie Dimon,
yes, and as
then
a
what
result
happens?
of all that, we got $20 billion for California.
10x what? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
great. And I
that's
think
right.
that is a great example of public power, right?
That's right.
Baratunde had been talking about the power of government. He actually referenced, the idea that government is all of us. That is actually Franklin D. Roosevelt's
That's
famous, government is not above us, government
right.
is us.
That's right.
And
That's right.
it's important for us to remember not just that there is too much concentrated corporate power, but also that we can use public power, government power, as you did and as you are admonishing us all to,
on behalf of the people.
To rebalance it.
On behalf
right.
of the people.
So I think actually that kind of 1-2 punch is a really great way to think about that. So I want to actually turn to one other time that you have done that, because obviously the banks are not the only place where we've seen concentrated corporate power essentially take advantage of working families. Colleges, we had a conversation earlier, Julie Morgan talked about college financing. The higher education system in this country also does suffer from that. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, in particular, the privatization of education.
Which is not like UC Berkeley, where my parents went.
And where my parents went.
Right, exactly. Where I went, actually.
And I went to Howard.
We can talk about that too. We should talk about that too. But so much to discuss. But let's stay on topic.
Well, I sued one of the major for-profit colleges, Corinthian colleges, when I was Attorney General, because what we saw, and this can be the tendency, we always have to examine the business model of the business and then determine what is its priority. And what we saw is that clearly with this institution, a for-profit institution, they were prioritizing their profit over public education and over educating their students. And so they had been engaging in the most fraudulent practices, explicitly targeting. I mean, this is the great thing about having the power to subpoena. We got their marketing documents where they explicitly talked about targeting vulnerable and desperate people, who of course were people of color, immigrants, adults with children who may be single parents who wanted to pay their life savings to get an education, to do better and have a job that would pay them well and sustain their family. And so we prosecuted them and basically ended up shutting them down. But what we see across the board also, and you can track this over a period of decades, is that we have not only been moving towards privatizing essential government services, and by that, I think we can categorize 3 services that are critically important that we allow for public funding and that we as government do. And it's going to be about public safety, public education, and public health. There should always be an option for everyone to receive those services free
Publicly.
of charge. And free of charge.
Right, right.
And so,
So just, let's say them again. Health,
public
safety,
health, public safety, and public education. And what you can
Right.
see is that over a period of time, and I'm going to now specifically on education talk about K through 12, we have seen that, I mean, and in that most recent case, right, that's been in the news the last couple of days.
Yes.
But what has been happening in terms of devaluing the public education. And so we have all kinds of systems in place currently that are upside down in terms of really accomplishing the mission of public education. One, I've been traveling to a lot of rural communities, right? We have a system of funding school districts based on a tax base of that community. Well, that doesn't make any sense because just think about it. So that means that those communities that have the lowest resources in terms of income and therefore a tax base receive the lowest in terms of resources, and they tend, by the way, not coincidentally, to be those that are the highest in need of those resources. You can look what's been happening over a period of time where we are failing to pay our teachers. I can't tell you the number of teachers I have met who are working 2, sometimes 3 jobs. And going back to California and the circumstances in which we were raised, I was in elementary school, public elementary school, where Mrs. Frances Wilson, God rest her soul, was my first grade teacher. She had 22 kids in the class, 2 teachers' aides. Mrs. Wilson attended my law school graduation. And back in the old days, we put those resources into our public education system. So I'm actually sitting here talking to you as a member of the United States Senate, and the other thing I'm doing, right? These are the things that we once did, but over a period of time, we've been taking resources away from our public schools. We have not been paying our teachers their value. Look, there are only 2 groups of people raising our children: parents and teachers. And yet we are not paying the teachers the value that they are contributing to our society. And so, the issue of education, both in terms of for-profit education, but also the failure to support public education is to our collective demise.
And so one of the things that you referenced here, and one of the rules that runs through all of our government services, all of our public services, is the tax code.
Yes.
Right? So let's
Absolutely
talk
right.
a little bit about the tax code.
Yeah.
Lots of news these days about tax ideas.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how you can think about the tax code as it can be used for bold.
So my definition of bold in this context is that we have to rewrite the rules in a way that we are supporting working middle-class families in America, because we're not. The rules over a period of time have been written to the exclusion of working middle-class families. So what I am proposing is we change the tax code, and specifically that we do it in this way: that for families that are making less than $100,000 a year, they receive a tax credit of up to $6,000 a year that they can then receive at up to $500 a month. And it has been described by economists as what will be one of the most significant tax cuts for middle-class families in generations. And here's the reason that this has been the focus. In America today, almost half of American families are a $400 unexpected expense away from complete upheaval. That could be the car breaking down. That could be an unexpected medical bill. In America today, and that's one source of information. Another source of information tells us in America today, there are 12 million people a year who are going to payday lenders to borrow up to $400 a month to get through the month, and being charged interest rates that are in the hundreds, like up to 300% in America today. In America today, In 99% of the counties, if you are a minimum wage worker working full-time, you cannot afford market rate for a one-bedroom apartment. These are the realities and the truths about America today. And these truths have a direct impact on middle-class working families. And so I'm proposing that we give them a lift up. And so our proposal, we actually called it the LIFT Act, would benefit 1 out of 2 American families. It would benefit 2 out of 3 American children. For African American families, 60% would be lifted out of poverty as a result of this initiative.
So I'm actually going to close quickly by asking you one more thing about taxes, and then I think we've got to let...
I see a hook over there.
Yes, exactly. Yes. There's some people. But, you know, I think what's so interesting and exciting about the range of tax ideas out there is just how big they are. There are, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the way, how do you think the tax code could be used for middle class families, and also to do that kind of taming the tides that you've been talking about. And let me just get one more thing in here, which is that the reason I think taxes are so important is that the tax code, lower taxes, lower taxes, lower taxes, have been at the center of conservative politics for 40 years. The tax revolt started in our home state.
Yes, yes it did.
Jarvis Dan, as you remember.
And then Prop 13.
That's right. That's so. So how can the tax code be used in the biggest possible way in this kind of tame the top measure also?
Well, first of all, we need to correct some recent activity. And that means we need to repeal this tax bill that was passed that benefits the top 1% and the biggest corporations in America. You know, and it's an interesting thing as it relates to the top 1% who benefit. The numbers I've seen mean that they will benefit on average of up to about $66,000 a year. They don't need that money. And a lot of them didn't even ask for it. So it makes no sense on every level, especially when you understand where middle-class working families are today and how they are struggling to pay a $400 unexpected expense and have to go to the payday lender to get through the month. So that's one thing that we have to do about the tax code, which is understand that there are a lot of things built into it, like the carried interest loophole. Like, we got to deal with that stuff. We need to deal with Glass-Steagall. And understand that the merger of the commercial side and the investment side of banks has not been to the benefit of working families in America. So there is a lot that needs to happen that is about speaking truth about what is necessary to build the economy of the United States. Because guess what? When you lift up the economic health and well-being of middle-class families, everybody in the country benefits economically. And so it is going to be about reversing some of what has recently happened that is just not only immoral, but just doesn't make financial sense. And I think it's all doable.
Well, on that note of morality and plain old good economic sense.
And optimism.
I was going to say that. I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
On behalf of everyone here at Bold vs. Old. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.